When Gary underwent the assessment in high school, he admitted to thinking about suicide, but mainly when he was under intense pressure. Without explaining his coping mechanism, Gary indicated that he simply got through whatever his stressors were. In his later years of high school and after graduation, Gary's violence was becoming more apparent. He was also growing bigger and becoming stronger, which made his mother increasingly worried about her own safety. Her son never socialized and had no close friends. By 2020, Gary had completely stopped taking his Lexapro and other medications. Later that same year is when he worked for the FedEx Indianapolis location, from August to October of 2020. Gary was fired because he simply stopped showing up for work. Otherwise, there were no issues or concerns between employer and employee.
He was last employed in 2020.
However, there were issues in Gary's life. As we are about to discuss, Gary's mental health seriously declined in the early half of 2020. Perhaps if greater intervention was done, this case might not have happened. On March 3, 2020, Gary's mom called 911 because she feared her son was going to commit suicide by cop. The reason for her concern is that the previous day, March 2nd, she and Gary went shopping at an Army surplus store called the Gun Bunker, which is where he purchased some meals ready to eat, also known as MREs. Gary also bought a shotgun. This certainly seems to be an off purchase for the angry and sometimes violent young man who put her in a constant state of fear. However, Gary's mom later explained that because her son was 18 years old, he could buy the gun with or without her. At least with her, she was aware of what he had and what he was up to. At least, she thought so, though she was painfully wrong. Even though Gary wasn't able to purchase ammunition for the shotgun, the store was out. His mother was concerned for her safety. You see, she asked Gary what he intended to use his new gun for, and as soon as the words escaped her mouth, Gary was outraged. He made a fist in her direction and actually struck her in the arm, telling his own mother to shut up. Gary threatened his mother that he planned to aim the unloaded shotgun at a police officer, so the officer would have to shoot Gary, who presumed he would instantly die. Though she assisted in helping Gary obtain his weapon, she deep down knew it wasn't right, and she needed to get that gun out of his possession. The next best thing was to report the situation to the juvenile courts, who placed Gary on an immediate detention mental health temporary hold. Gary was taken to the Sidney and Lois Eskenazi Hospital for an evaluation, yet he only lasted 2 hours before calling his mom and telling her that she needed to come back and pick him up, or else he would leave on his own accord and would walk home. Gary's shotgun was removed from the home, and he was later interviewed by an FBI agent based on the items discovered, which included apparent internet searches for white supremacist websites. Because of his mental health breakdown and evidence collected, Gary was handcuffed and transported to the hospital for an evaluation. As he was being escorted away, Gary shakily said to the officers, quote, "Please just turn the power strip off on my computer. I don't want anyone to see what's on it." An alarming statement, to be sure, and all the more reason the evaluation was the correct move. When police further talked with Gary, he really downplayed the suicide attempt and the severity of his depression, indicating that he might benefit from outpatient counseling. Gary's medical records noted that he wished to die by suicide by cop, yet he felt fine. Those two are at complete odds with one another. Gary's mom most certainly didn't believe her son was okay, and pleaded with the police to take Gary's gun. She thought there was enough evidence to do so, and further, she felt that her son should be red flagged, which we will discuss in greater depth later. The police weren't in agreement with her, though, saying that this situation didn't fall under the red flag law, because they took the firearm and the family agreed not to attempt to retrieve it back from the police. Because they agreed not to try to get the gun back, police never filed a petition that is required under these circumstances. The petition must state why police had probable cause to confiscate the weapon. The failure to file the proper paperwork resulted in Gary's ability to purchase additional firearms. He bought the HM Defense HM15F in July and the Ruger AR-556 in September. Both were bought legally and using stimulus money that Gary received from the federal government.
It starts with the prosecutor, and then they ultimately submit it to the courts and to a judge.
And it was never submitted?
That's correct. It did not get into court. He did not make it into that red flag system. Although we kept the gun that we seized, he was still able to go out and legally purchase other firearms.
It seems that Gary had another fetish, this one being more inappropriate than his military fixation. He was consumed with all things My Little Pony. The last post Gary made on Facebook read, quote, "I hope I can be with Applejack in the afterlife. My life has no meaning without her." Applejack is one of the main characters in the My Little Pony series. The post included a snapshot of the cartoon pony and went up less than 1 hour before he executed a petrifying murder that caused so much destruction. Gary had 2 Facebook profiles, both of which are deleted now, but both contained a significant amount of My Little Pony photos and memes. It seems that Gary was fully enthralled with the fantasy world, enjoying video games like Halo, Minecraft, and Call of Duty. He played those games online with random strangers, though there didn't appear to be any reports of issues within the online gaming community. At one point, Gary attempted living on his own, but wasn't successful and moved back home. His main interests were all things military. There were nearly 175,000 files searched on his computer that was seized by police, and just under 200 of those files were related to the German military and German Nazi topics.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Gary's mental health took a dark turn in 2021, and he continued to be unbalanced. He was so obsessed with the military, but feared he would not be accepted due to the FBI having a file on him from the 2020 breakdown. A year after that episode, on March 19th, 2021, Gary's mom took him to the Midtown West Side Clinic for emergency counseling, where they waited for over 4 hours to be seen. The clinic simply didn't have time for Gary. 3 days later, he met with a social worker and explained that, quote, "I can get very, very angry." The social worker's note indicated that Gary lacked empathy and didn't seem to care about other people. He was deemed to be a moderate suicide risk, and a, quote, "suicide plan" was established, where if Gary was having suicidal thoughts, he would know what to do. This young man displayed every single red flag and sign that he was in desperate need of intensive mental health treatment. Yet, he was essentially shuffled through the system without any serious consideration. At least, that's how it appears in the aftermath. On March 31st, 2021, Gary met with yet another social worker and told this one much the same as the last, admitting that the incident with the FBI the year before was traumatic and upsetting for him, and he even admitted to trying to hang himself afterwards. Gary's final counseling session with his mom was on April 14th, 2021, the day before the shooting. Gary's mom attended this session because she was deeply concerned about him and felt he needed continuing treatment. She hoped to use the appointment time to urge Gary to keep going. There were several more appointments scheduled, but as we know, Gary would never make those sessions. Perhaps one of the most egregious oversights in this case is the failure to place Gary on the red flag list. There may be technicalities that prevented Gary from qualifying for this list, but if that is the case, then the fine details of the law ought to be revised. or each situation should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. The red flag law is also known as the Jake Laird law, who is the police officer it is named for. For background, on August 18, 2004, a man went berserk, using a rifle and 2 handguns to murder his mother before opening fire on the entire neighborhood. As soon as police arrived on scene, this man began shooting at them too. Immediately after Officer Laird exited his patrol vehicle, he was shot and killed. The bullet struck him in the cheek, just above his bulletproof vest. After a shootout with the other officers, the man was killed. 4 additional police officers were wounded but survived. Several months before this deadly shooting, on January 20th, 2004, officers were dispatched to the man's home after he became aggressive with paramedics. You see, the man was schizophrenic and was off his medication, enough so that he was in a full-blown manic episode. He was placed into a mental detention facility at St. Francis Hospital, and each of his guns, which were numerous, were confiscated, along with all ammunition. After he was released from the hospital, he inquired about retrieving his firearms. This man wanted his guns back, though police tried everything to prevent this from happening. They exhausted every avenue, yet there was no legal authority to stop them from returning the guns as requested. As shocking as this is, there was truly nothing police could do, so the weapons were returned in March of 2004. If such a law existed then, Officer Laird might be here today. The red flag law allows police to seize guns from mentally unstable and dangerous individuals. The confiscation can be carried out with a warrant that is based on probable cause that leaving the weapons in the individual's possession is a danger to themselves and the public. In extreme cases, the seizure can be made without an immediate warrant, but it is later subjected to the court's approval. Besides Indiana, several other states have instituted variations of the red flag laws. There is, however, one loophole that should be promptly corrected. A red flag case could stay open for several months, while the gun owner can collect their own evidence to bolster their case. As the case is pending, there is nothing preventing said gun owner from purchasing additional weapons, including guns. To be clear, this podcast isn't trying to litigate gun control in the telling of these stories. We only wish to present these stories honoring the victims while examining what, if anything, could be done to prevent the shooting. The red flag laws appear, on the surface, to be a legitimate, reasonable means of trying to minimize the number of mass shootings we see on a near-weekly basis. It is worth looking further into. We all have the unique ability to help prevent such a catastrophic event from happening, if we keep our eyes and ears open and never hesitate to report when something, or someone, just doesn't seem right. It is our sincerest wish that there will be no more active or mass shooting stories to tell. We pray that love will prevail over hate.
Too many have died! We should say to ourselves, not one more!
In the meantime, we urge our listeners to stay aware of your surroundings and keep in touch with your loved ones. If you see something, say something. You never know how many lives you'll be saving.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Remember, if you see something, say something. There's no telling how many lives you may be saving.
A huge thank you to Darren Curtis, who composed some of the music used in this episode. Check him out at darrencurtismusic.com. DARRENCURTIS music.com.
Active shooter. Reports of an active shooter. Active shooter.
Active shooter mass casualty incidents.
Make sure to check us out on social media. We have a discussion group on Facebook. Just search for Active Shooter, the podcast discussion group. You can also find us on Instagram at Active the Podcast.